A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, we're joined today by David Robertson. He's from the Flea. He's also the minister of Scottskirk Presbyterian Church, and there is a lot going on in politics, and he joins us now to discuss this. David, welcome.
Yeah, nice to be with you. Thank you very much.
David, there is heaps going on in the context of elections around the world. Let's start with your thoughts on the UK election.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, in the time that we've got, I would like to mention the UK and the French elections. There are other ones that are going on, and I'm pretty sure we'll return to. But the UK one is fascinating. And for many people in Australia, of course, there are a lot of connections with the UK. At one level, it appears as though there's been a kind of major change. And in fact, the theme was change. And there's been this massive majority for the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party has gone down. I think the Labour was about 412. And the Conservatives gone down to about 120 seats. But there's another story in there. In fact, there are several other stories, and I'll just mention a couple of them. One is that turnout was low. The other is that on 34% of the vote, Labour got that huge majority, which is the lowest that a governing party has ever had. And that's the trend in Australia as well. The primary votes of the two major parties is declining. And in the UK, Reform, which is the reason I think the Conservative won, got 4 million votes, but because of the quirkiness of the system, ended up with only 5 seats. And from my point of view as a Scot, the Scottish National Party went down from 48 seats to 9 seats. So for those of you who are worried about the breakup of the United Kingdom, forget it. It's not going to happen for at least a decade, if then. So, I mean, those are fairly significant things. Whether Keir Starmer, he seems very competent, whether he is able to run the economy and so on, that's one issue. On moral and ethical issues, I would have major concerns, not least that he's appointed a women's minister who doesn't know what a woman is. So the whole transgender stuff is going to keep going. So I think there are some major concerns. There are some disillusionments that people have. But part of me, I don't know what your taste in music is. I'm a big fan of The Who, and I love their song, Won't Get Fooled Again, Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss. I suspect that's going to be the case. And it's not good to have a government elected by only 20% of the electorate, which is what has happened.
That's a stunning figure, isn't it? 20% of the electorate has effectively voted in a new government. You've covered a lot there, David. And for our listeners, I think you need to explain what the Reform Party is, because that was an interesting phenomenon, the Reform Party. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so there's a politician that people either love or hate. I find him a fascinating character in lots of ways, not least because there's a case that could be argued, he's been the most effective politician in Britain for about 30 years, because Nigel Farage, basically pushed on the Brexit thing, and he won, and nobody thought he would. He started up this party because he was so fed up of what the Conservatives were doing on immigration, and virtually from scratch, and with very little resources, he managed to get 4 million votes, which is utterly astounding. It's ironic that on balance, it took 22,000 votes to elect a Labour MP. It took 1 million votes to elect a Reform MP. I think the Australian system is much better for two reasons. Number one, I think that the list system is better. And number two is compulsory voting, which I was totally against, but now I'm in favour of. And I think there's some big things there. There is one other thing that's a major concern, and I think will directly correlate with Australia. And for once, I agree with the Sydney Morning Herald on this, who've also said this. There were 5 independent MPs elected effectively as Islamist MPs in areas where there are a significant number, 35, 40, 50% Muslim, many from the Middle East and Pakistan and Afghanistan and so on. They stood on an anti-Israel, pro-Gaza type thing, pro-Palestinian ticket, and 5 of them got elected. And another 3 came within a whisker of getting elected. Now, this is the first time out with Northern Ireland in many, many decades that politicians have been elected on religious grounds. And there are signs that in West Sydney, in some areas of Melbourne, The Labour Party here in Australia may be particularly vulnerable to that. And I think it is a very, very dangerous move in a democracy.
Well, and it's irreversible. I hate to say it. Once those communities are established anywhere in the world, we all know they have a very high birth rate. They're not going to go back to where they came from because they always come from third world countries. And this is a emerging trend for sure. But so with the Reform Party, how many seats did they actually win?
5.
Yeah, it's not many, is it? 4 million votes for 5 seats.
5 seats, yeah.
Yeah, but let's talk about the turnout. So why do you think a lot of people didn't turn out to vote? Do you think they've just given up on the whole democratic system in Britain?
I think they've given up on the parties. I think they, like me, they would share the view that meet the new boss, same as the old boss. I think there was just a disillusionment in so many ways. The two main parties, and indeed the Liberal Democrats as well, most of the political class, they are largely disconnected from many. So, I mean, in the UK, if you are a social conservative, which many people are, I'm not just talking about Christians, well, who do you vote for? And also, I just feel that the disillusionment, that would be the main thing for me. I mean, I struggled to vote. I did vote. I had a postal vote, and I actually did end up voting for the Labour man in Dundee just to get the SNP guy out. Mine was an entirely negative vote. Also, I actually knew the Labour guy, and he was a decent guy, so I voted for the candidate. I would not vote for the Labour Party per se, but I voted for the candidate, and I voted as a negative thing to get rid of the previous MP. So, I mean, but I did toy with the whole idea of not voting at all, because I was just, I don't want to vote, for pro-abortion. I don't want to vote for people who support euthanasia. I don't want to vote for people who won't help the poor, so, but then you're not going to have anything that's perfect. So you end up voting for the least worst. But somebody like me, I read lots of stuff and look at lots of different things. I investigated all the different candidates. Most people won't bother doing that. And I think they've just lost hope.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so why did the Scottish National Party lose so many seats? What was the big swing against them all about?
So they're trying to spin it as, well, actually, it was a pro-Labour to get the Tories out. But the Tories are never going to get in Scotland. They only had 6 seats. They lost 1, so they've got 5 in Scotland. The reality is, just as in England, the vote for Labour was really a vote against the Tories, get the government out. So in Scotland, the vote was very much against the SNP. Basically, they are deemed to be incompetent in government by many people. People are just fed up of what's happened. And they've used the independence issue to garner support, I think, knowing that independence was never going to happen. And they've wasted a great opportunity to get independence. I think the last 5 years was a fantastic opportunity for them to get independence. But I think they've wasted it. I think the corruption around Nicola Sturgeon, the previous leader, the failure of Humza Yousaf, we called him the Minister for Palestine, not Scotland. He resigned, and they brought back an old leader, John Swinney. There's a Christian lady who's the deputy first leader, Kate Forbes, who's by far the best and the most competent. And I'm not saying that just because she's a Christian. Most people recognize that. But, the rest of the party, I suspect the progressives within it would have a heart attack if she ever became leader. But that was their only hope, and they blew it. So when you're incompetent as a government, that happened with the Tories as well. And when you don't offer any alternative, I mean, lots and lots of Christians supported the Scottish National Party, but we were put off by their green woke progressivism, and so there just wasn't any reason to vote for them. And people, again, sadly, people vote negatively just to get them out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a really comprehensive analysis, and I just want to give you a plug. Your Flea podcast was actually ranked 2nd in Great Britain last week as far as UK election coverage goes, which is a huge achievement for an Australian-based podcaster. So well done on that. Obviously, the content is great. But let's go across the pond, which once upon a time was so hard to get across, wasn't it? Especially when you were part of the French and Spanish Armada and you wanted to come to Britain. They never quite made it. But let's go across that pond now and talk about the French election, because that is a fascinating ongoing process, isn't it?
Yeah, and how it's understood. So, see, it's very interesting. So, RN, which is the what used to be the national, people would call it the National Front, but the Le Pen thing. Now, initially, that was a very far-right organization, but it's changed enormously, and I think it genuinely has. I think it's probably, it is right-wing, but you to call it fascist would be very, very stupid. But lots of people do. They call it fascist, and they say, so shockingly, in the European elections, they won the European elections in France. So Macron, who's the ultimate centrist technocrat president, some people say he took the huff. Some people say he was being clever and trying to get the RN in, and so blame them for any government troubles in France, and there are plenty, held an election. Now, the first round of that election, much to everyone's shock, RN came way ahead. But in the second round, what they did was they vote for constituencies, and basically a combination of the far left, and you're talking about the wacko communists, amongst others, a guy called Melanchthon, who's has often been accused of being anti-Semitic, and I think he is, and very extreme. They combined with the centrists, with Macron, so that if one of them was second or first in a region, the other would withdraw. So as a result, they won, and they... but it's a mess. So let me explain this. RN's vote actually went up. Really quite astonishing. Probably with about 150 seats. The Macron's group will end up with about 150 seats, and the far left will end up with about 170, 180. But what that means is nobody is going to be able to govern.
On their own,
so it's going to be absolute chaos. And again, a huge issue in France is Islam. I mean, it's a massive issue. And immigration, of course, being a big issue as well. So I think that, in a sense, Marine Le Pen has dodged a bullet here, and I think that this sets her up for a presidential run in a couple of years, which she may well win the way things are going. But it's pretty chaotic, and I think it's right for us to be concerned about that. But it does fascinate me that many left-wing people, and to some degree I consider myself to be left-wing in some things, but many left-wing people in Australia are saying this is great as long as the fascists don't get in. Well, it's a very simplistic view. RN are not basically fascist, and secondly, if you are voting for extreme communists, you are voting for an absolute nightmare. And I don't understand why, if in Sydney Uni, as I've seen happen, if someone was to put up a poster saying vote fascist or vote Nazi, it would automatically, they could be charged. But people put up posters saying vote communist, and they put up the symbols of the Russian communists or the Chinese communists or the communist flag. And communism killed 100 million people. It's the most deadly of ideologies. And here we have Western liberals and centrists and the markets actually celebrating an extreme communist potentially coming to power. It's breathtaking for me.
Oh, it's also an indication of ignorance. There's also a lot of evidence to suggest that both of our major political parties in Australia are funded by the Chinese Communist Party as well. So there's a bit of a rabbit trail we could go down there as well. But David, this has been a really comprehensive, it is fairly brief analysis, but it is very interesting, and it just seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, doesn't it, that most people are disillusioned with the establishment, especially in America. You listen to the average American, they're like, what has happened to America? The only candidates we've got are two old guys. One of them doesn't even look capable of living another 4 years. The other one is obviously very extreme and egotistical, and that's Trump. And so worldwide, it just seems to be a trend, doesn't it, that the average person has lost connection to the ruling political class.
Yeah, so I wrote an article for Christian Today, and I think it is certainly still on their Christian Today in the UK, and it's still on their website, and I think it's still their number one article, talking about how Christians need to respond to that. And maybe can I just read you the summary of that, because I think it might help and encourage your listeners if we can do that.
Absolutely.
Because, or if I can remember what it was, if I can remember what I wrote myself. But I mean, the main thing I was trying to get was that we don't trust in princes, and that we need to learn to think about these things from a biblical perspective. So at the end, I mean, I did this a little bit of this kind of analysis because there were some sadly, some church leaders who are saying the new government in the UK is a new sense of hope and a new beginning. And no, it's not. And these are the principles I would say. Don't put your trust in politicians, Psalm 146, verse 3. Pray for politicians, 1 Timothy 2:1. Where there is no vision, the people perish, Proverbs 29:18. We are to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God, Micah 6:8. We are to preach the word in season or out of season, 2 Timothy 4:2. We are to proclaim the word to politicians, Psalm 119, verse 46. And for me, this is the key one. Jesus is king. Before him, all nations, individuals, and leaders will bow, Philippians 2:10. And I think for the Christian, we should not be hopeless. We do what we can. We are salt and light within the system that we have. But the kingdom that is coming is the kingdom of Christ and our Lord, and none of us should be in despair.
Amen. What a great way to finish. David Robertson, I encourage everyone, check out the We Flea blog. There's so much wisdom on there. Also his podcast, the We Flea podcast. David Robertson, I want to thank you so much for joining us on 2020 Today.
It's been a privilege.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.